Now, Doug, Herbert, just take us back a second. The 13th of November terrorist attacks, of course, targeted Paris, also Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, but they were meticulously planned over the course of many months from abroad. The masterminds of this operation took their orders from the Islamic State Group in Syria, but they used Belgium as their staging ground.
Absolutely. I mean, all eyes obviously focused on Paris, Paris being obviously where the attacks occurred. This is effectively the trial of ISIS, of the Islamic State Group. Let's not forget, they declared their caliphate when June 2014, right, over a year before the terror attacks. What they did a few months later is more interesting. In 2015, they actually set up an entity overseen by someone named Osama Attar, what was its job to basically plan, organize, orchestrate, coordinate terrorist attacks outside the Iraqo-Syrian region. Remember, Iraq and Syria is where the self-proclaimed caliphate extended across. But their ambitions were larger. They wanted to be able to stage massive terror operations outside of that zone, and notably in Europe, and more notably in France. So they chose Belgium. Belgium was a perfect staging ground, a propitious geography in the sense that it was in the heart of the Schengen zone with free movement, easy borders, pretty porous. And it happened to be right next to France. They wanted a prominent world-class capital. France had been also very much front and center on the radar of the jihadist propaganda, if you will, the anti-French bashing, sloganeering. So France was always front and center there. Let's remember, a lot of these suspects were Franco-Belgian, were Franco-Moroccan, but they were commandeered, like I said, by ISIS. Of the 6 suspects who will be judged in absentia, that is, there are 14 who will be present, but 20 are being judged altogether. 5 of them are actually senior members or former senior members of the Islamic State Group, presumed to have been killed in Syria, presumed because we really don't know their whereabouts right now. Remember, though, there will be 6 so-called suicide belt candidates of those 14 physically present in the courtroom. 6 of them, including obviously Salah Abdeslam and Mohammed Abrini, who we just saw in that report. Now, Mohammed Abrini only went once to Syria. Salah Abdeslam, as far as we know, never once went to Syria. But the 4 other candidates who will be physically present, who are thought to have been the so-called suicide martyrs, would-be suicide martyrs, but it never got to that point. They all were sent to Europe from the Iraqo-Syrian ISIS self-proclaimed caliphate. So yeah, when you watch this trial today, taking place in France with a lot of mixed French nationality, Belgian nationality citizens, but keep your eyes riveted on the ISIS caliphate, because that is where the inspiration, the masterminding, and the planning of these attacks came from.
Now, Vivienne and Walt, you're a journalist with Time magazine. You're based here in Paris. You covered those attacks and their aftermath extensively. What are your feelings today as this mammoth trial gets underway?
Well, I totally agree with Doug. And certainly after the November 13th attacks, not only did I interview a lot of the survivors, and I've gone back in recent months to interview them about what they've experienced the last few years, but I also spent quite some time in Brussels and in Molenbeek, the neighborhood from where all these ISIS operatives came from. And what was just so striking is how utterly unprepared the Belgian intelligence services were. Any local police officer knew these guys. They knew that they were trouble. Many of them knew that they were hardcore radicals. And yet they simply didn't have their eye on them. They had a very fractured policing system. You could actually see into Abdeslam's apartment from the window of the Molenbeek mayor. I myself stood in her office and saw that. They just were asleep at the wheel. The fact that Abdeslam was able to get out of Paris that night after the attacks, make his way 300 kilometers to Brussels, and then come all the way back again, was just absolutely astonishing. And I think more than the 20 people on trial today, what's also on trial is 2 governments, Belgium and France, and whether or not they're actually now prepared for what might be in the works at the moment. It's a chilling thought, but I think certainly for a lot of people, in Paris, it is on their mind. You know, are we better prepared now than we were 6 years ago? Or is something actually being planned right under our nose that people might not know about?
And of course, today is a moment where a lot of people are thinking back to the trauma of that night, the trauma of victims, their families, but also of the city. It was a series of attacks that affected Paris profoundly. Do you think Paris has changed in any fundamental way since that night?
I mean, it certainly did change for a while. It was, startling to see, military personnel on the streets of Paris. And it did have the sort of feeling of a besieged city for quite a while. I think what's interesting is that feeling very much like we had in New York. Was that feeling kind of became a permanent reality, at least on the surface. Underneath, I think it still has to be tested as to whether or not it can prevent and catch plots in the making. The government says it can. I'm not sure it's actually been tested on a really serious level. Hopefully they're correct. But we're not sure if these patrols, if the Vigipirate, the system that's in place in Paris is really effective enough against, determined cells that are, at work plotting some attack over many months.
Now, of course,